Welcome back to Cities on Console. Welcome if you are new. Today we will be doing a deep dive into the most recent developer diary, and what makes this channel a little different from some of the other channels you might watch is that we'll be doing it from a console player's perspective. So for those of you who don't know, I play Cities Skylines exclusively on console, PlayStation 5 to be specific, and I plan to do the same for Cities 2. Now, practically all the channels out there are geared toward modded PC play, and it can be hard to find content for vanilla and console players, which is actually exactly why I started this channel in the first place. But without falling too deep down that rabbit hole, we'll get into the purpose of today's video. But before doing so, I want to ask you to consider subscribing if you haven't already, and to drop a like if you end up enjoying today's video or finding it informative. And feel free to drop a dislike if not. Any engagement is welcome and helps me grow as a creator and make more of the content you all find helpful, entertaining, and worthwhile. But without further ado, let's get into this week's dev diary. So, of course, this week we are talking about zones and signature buildings. There's a little bit of an intro here. We'll skip that and get into the meat and potatoes of the dev diary, so to speak. And to do that, we'll start with zoning tools. So the zoning tools feature the familiar options: fill, marquee, and paint tools, which we already have in Cities 1. So if you play Cities Skylines currently, you're familiar with these. The fill tool fills all the continuous zoning cells with a selected zoning type. The marquee allows you to select a rectangular area and fill with that. And the paint tool makes it possible to create very specific zoning areas by painting as little as one cell at a time. So as it says here, if you want to create separate 2x2 residential zones with the paint tool, you can. We'll go ahead and open this in another tab and get a better look at it. So as it was talking about, doing separate 2x2 residential zones, say if you were building a little rural area outside the main city and you wanted them to have a little more land, as you would see in rural areas, you could do, a little 2x2 square here, skip a couple 2x2, skip a couple 2x2. Basically, that's what that's referring to. But again, if you play City Skylines currently, a lot of you're already familiar with that. So everything's actually, none of this is actually new. This is all kind of already at our disposal in Cities 1. But then it gets to a couple things that have been kind of expanded upon. So they talk about dezoning being simplified. Dezoning no longer has a separate tool, as you can dezone any zone type by pressing the right mouse button while you have any of these zoning tools active. While the fill tool is active, you can dezone an entire continuous area. So basically it just works the same as the fill tool. When you're zoning, it works the same way in reverse when you're dezoning, right? Instead of clicking to fill the entire area, you click to dezone the entire area. The marquee tool and the paint tool, of course, the same, just in reverse as well, so we won't read too much into that. The thing I'm curious about with this, though, the question I have is it talks about you can dezone any zone type by pressing the right mouse button while you have it selected. So I'm assuming there's going to be a console equivalent for that. I'm always a little bit disappointed when, there's things like this, everything's sort of written as if everyone's playing on PC. And they don't, put in parentheses or under the image here, there's no subtext saying like on console or on PlayStation it'll be R1, on Xbox it'll be, the left trigger, like whatever that equivalent's going to be. It just never says that, and a little bit annoying, but I'm sure there'll be a console equivalent for that. So we'll just wait and see how that goes when the time comes. But then it moves into architectural themes. So as a new feature, the zoning tools are able to zone buildings from different architectural themes. When starting a new city, one of the first options is to choose the theme for the city. The theme dictates the building's visual style, street markings, roadside props, as well as the look of service vehicles. And with the zoning tool themes, you can zone buildings from both available architectural styles, which it specifies are North American and European. Which, that's pretty familiar for anyone who plays Cities 1. You have those two themes, and a European city can feature North American style buildings and vice versa. So, of course, like I just said, if you play Cities 1, any of us who do, we are familiar with the North American theme and the European theme. That's kind of what we've always had, right? But what's really cool here in Cities 2 is that it says one of the first options is to choose the theme for the city. I'm guessing this is, once you select your map. Whereas in Cities 1, you chose your map. If it was a European map, then you played with the European theme. If it was not a European map, then you played with the North American theme. And that was just locked. At least if you, like me, play console or vanilla, and don't have, some Steam Workshop mod or something to let you adjust that. And also, going into what it says a little later, a European city can feature North American style buildings and vice versa. So I think that's really cool. So even if you are building in a North American theme in general, you might have a little, European style town somewhere. And that's actually really common here in America. You can, I currently live in Arizona, but I used to live in Georgia. And there's a little town there, kind of a little bit of a tourist destination, a place a lot of people would go from North Georgia, where I lived. They'd go to this town called Helen. And Helen is essentially just a very European sort of themed town. So anyway, so if you want to build something like that, have a little European sort of suburb or something outside your North American city, you have that option. Really cool. I think it's really cool. And the European buildings don't look terrible anymore. But then we move into zone types. So this as well is kind of a little bit, a few things that we're familiar with and a little bit new on top of it as well. So Cities 2 features more zone types than its predecessor. Residential zone types have been more than doubled, featuring 6 different zone types. I think in Cities 1 we just have low density and high density, right? So I guess you could technically say tripled, unless I'm forgetting something. But anyway, neither here nor there. 6 different zone types to create more diverse and realistic cities. The familiar zones are still available. Yeah, low density housing, which are the detached houses, and high density housing, which are those, tall residential towers. But the new residential zone types include medium density row housing, which are wall-to-wall homes. That's actually what's shown here in this image. I'll blow that up a little bit. This is the European style as well, very clearly. It has those sort of triangular shaped roofs rather than the just the flat roofs like they showed in the medium density American right here, right? So that's the European style in the picture here. But yeah, in addition to those, you have the medium density housing with apartment buildings, mixed housing with shops occupying the ground floor and apartments taking up the rest of the buildings. I think that is super cool and will make your downtown just a lot more realistic. And of course you have low rent housing with large apartment buildings that house lots of small apartments. I think that's really cool as well. Low rent housing is especially useful for low income residents such as students and young adults who have moved out of their parents' homes to live in their first apartment. I think that's actually super cool. I think, no, those aren't really shown here, but that said, this shows at least the mixed use buildings. So you see how here you have the shops on the ground floor and then you have the apartment buildings above. So very realistic look, very cool, clean look as well, and those will just be so much fun to work with. Okay, cool. And then it goes into kind of which types of residential suit which types of citizens. So low and medium density housing tend to have larger apartments, which most residents find appealing. However, the cost of living is usually higher in smaller buildings, such as detached houses, row houses, and medium-sized apartment buildings, as the costs are divided among fewer households. This makes sense, because just, mathematically, if the land value in an area is, say, or just say the rent for an area is the equivalent of $250,000 a month. If you're splitting that between, 100 families, or you're splitting that between 1,000 families, that is obviously a massive, massive difference. So that totally makes sense. But it goes on to say, increasing land value also affects smaller buildings more. Well, that's kind of what we were just talking about, as it affects the size of the rent in general. On the other hand, high-density housing can fit a lot of people in a small area, but its main negative aspect is that the apartments are usually small. Conversely, the rents are more affordable as the building's upkeep is divided among a large number of households. So that just reiterates what we were just talking about. Mixed housing, which is again what we're looking at here, mixed use with the commercial on the bottom, seeks to bring a more realistic feel to the game by allowing you to build more traditional city centers where commercial and residential zones coexist. Mixed housing also answers two different zone type demands. That's really cool. I mean, as it should, but that's just kind of a new fun feature in Cities 2 that we never had in Cities 1, where it will support both medium residential housing demand and commercial demand, allowing both to occupy the precious space in busy city centers. Commercial businesses pay a portion of the rent for mixed housing, which causes the rent for the households to be more affordable. Very cool stuff there. I really like how there's all these tiny little details that I don't know if we're going to have to pay attention to them so much in Cities 2. I kind of hope we do. I hope it's not like overly complicated where it takes away from the fun of building a beautiful city. But I hope there is just some depth to that, where you actually notice this stuff on the hour-by-hour gameplay of City Skylines, rather than it just being something that works in the background, and maybe if you click on a building, you can see, the company name at the bottom or see what families live there. I want it to be something that kind of you notice without having to click into it and pinpoint it. I hope it's kind of a part of the living, breathing, working, functional city as you're building it. Residential zone stuff out of the way, we get into commercial zones. So commercial zones feature low and high density buildings where companies sell all types of goods manufactured locally or imported from outside connections. This includes everything from cars and groceries to clothes and paper products. And they also provide the citizens with leisure options in the form of restaurants, movie theaters, bars, hotels, and more. Commercial zones thrive close to residential areas as they provide them with customers. So that, again, is a little bit, familiar and also a little bit new. So in Cities 1, of course, you need your commercial areas to be accessible to residences, or they don't have enough customers and they don't sell their goods, right? But what's new here is that it's specifying that they make cars and groceries and clothes and paper products. Are these actually going to be individual resources within the game that are somehow visible in a menu or a supply chain somehow? I'm very curious about that. Could be quite cool. The major differences between low and high density businesses, apart from their physical size, are the types of companies as well as the volume of goods they're able to sell to consumers. The low-density businesses are usually boutiques, gas stations, small stores, and bars, while the high-density businesses tend to be supermarkets, department stores, and various recreational locations such as theaters and hotels. That's actually quite cool. It looks like in the image here, let me mark that so I know where I'm leaving off. It looks like in the image here, so we've got a gas station, it looks like. I can't tell really what's behind, if that's a department store or if any of these is a department store for that matter. Hard to tell, but we very clearly have a gas station here, which that alone adds some realism to the game, right? Never had real gas stations in vanilla City Skylines, other than that one weird thing that developed once in a while that had like the squirrel or the donut spinning around on it. I guess that was a gas station, but goodness gracious, it was terrible. But moving on. Small businesses employ fewer workers and can serve smaller amounts of customers, while large businesses, on the other hand, are populated with many employees and thus can service a greater number of people. This also means they're able to sell more goods from their stock compared to smaller, low-density businesses. Makes sense? Commercial businesses benefit from local manufacturing as they have quick access to the goods that they are selling. Local manufacturers also benefit from the nearby commercial companies as the transportation costs of manufactured goods to the retailers are low, allowing them to earn higher profits per sold unit. That totally makes sense. In real life, as any type of industrial company, you would have these costs to contend with. Whether you can sell to a closer market and you're not paying crazy amounts for transport. Whereas if you are exporting or transporting larger distances, then of course that's going to have to be factored into the pricing somehow, or you're going to be losing out on profits. And there's just a lot to unpack there that obviously goes way beyond me. I don't work in industrial logistics or anything, but it's just as a general understanding. Very cool that that's going to have that realism to it. And then of course we get into industrial zones. So industrial zones are divided into manufacturing companies and warehouses. Manufacturing encompasses most of the industrial zones as factories and workshops, while warehouses appear here and there, answering to the needs of the different companies and their production processes. Warehouses store produced goods that are ready to be shipped further, but are still waiting for transport or suitable buyers. That all makes sense. And as it shows here, we have an image of some of the industrial areas. You'll see a bunch of the factories here, and I guess here's a warehouse. Perhaps there's a warehouse. So yeah, very, very good looking compared to the generic industry in City Skylines 1. So excited for that. It goes on to say industrial zones manufacture goods from materials that are either transported from outside connections by delivery trucks or extracted and processed locally in specialized industrial areas. Some goods are sold to commercial businesses who then sell them to customers, for example food, while other goods are first sold to commercial businesses where they are further converted into products or immaterial goods, such as beverages turned into entertainment. That's interesting. Industrial zones attempt to sell goods to local buyers first. If there is an overproduction of a type of goods, the companies will ship the excess production to outside connections, but selling to the local market is always more profitable due to lower transportation costs. Totally makes sense. We talked about that earlier. Continuing to sell to outside connections will further decrease the profit as they have to ship the goods further and further to new buyers, simulating the eventual oversaturation of the market. Companies in general seek to reevaluate their business every now and then, adjusting the number of employees to match the current business landscape and market needs. That is a super cool detail, and I could see that being difficult to manage if you don't pay close attention. So in Cities 1, you really didn't have to pay that much attention to your RCI, your residential, commercial, and industrial demand. You did to an extent, especially in the early game, but later on, you could kind of just build what you wanted when you wanted for the most part, as long as it made some sort of sense and all three of those things at least existed. But the city wouldn't crash. I could see this, causing waves of problems. If you oversaturate the market and hundreds of people lose their jobs because the business is reassessed and they need to cut profits. I mean, this stuff you see happen in real life. All the tech layoffs in the last couple of years, this is very real stuff. But I can see it making the game very interesting and challenging in that regard. And here we have a warehouse. It says warehouses appear mixed in with the manufacturing industry and provide additional storage. And that is a very good looking warehouse. It looks like next to quite a few little warehouses around it as well, actually. So yeah, it looks like the generic areas, if you kind of just, mass zone them, you'll see a lot of the factories producing smoke above and a lot of the little warehouses kind of just strewn in, quote unquote, here and there, just like they said earlier in the article. But it looks very nice, and it's not turning the ground a stupid color and all that stuff like in Cities 1. It just looks like overall it's gonna be a lot more pleasant. And then we get into office zones. So similar to commercial zones, office zones are divided into low-density offices with small office buildings and high-density offices featuring glass-walled skyscrapers and office towers. Offices produce immaterial goods and services for private citizens and companies alike. Office companies convert technological goods manufactured in industrial zones into software and further into other immaterial goods such as telecom, finance, and media. That is really interesting. Clearly there's some sort of actual supply chain where quote-unquote software is being created and then it is being further processed into, like it says here, telecom, finance, media. I don't know, very interesting. But it goes on to say office zone companies include banks, electronics retailers, law firms, insurance companies, and telecommunications companies. Software is an important type of immaterial good for both the industrial and office sectors as they produce various goods. However, software in itself isn't sold to private customers. Other goods produced from software, such as telecom and finance, have a wider reach as private customers also benefit from them. Media is sold directly to citizens in the form of consumer electronics, video games, and such. So that's really cool. I guess you see a little, what was it, Game Go in Cities 1 came with the university's content creator pack, I think. Yeah, those were so good. Maybe we'll have little Game Goes sprinkled here and there throughout the town. In this image here, both low and high density offices provide your city with useful immaterial goods. So what are we looking at here? I guess these are some of the smaller low density office buildings, and maybe this here, or even this massive thing in the back. I can't really tell, but I'm guessing those are some variation of high density. These, at least, we can pretty safely assume are, and then this massive thing in the back may as well, or maybe as well. So we'll see. I can't wait to get my hand on this game though and just start mass zoning stuff and seeing what pops up and all the different little fun assets we can kind of play with. And then lastly, in this section, it touches on zone suitability. So each zone type has a zone suitability info view, which activates when you start zoning. Depending on the zone type, it shows pertinent information about which areas are suitable for the selected zone type. As an example, zoning commercial areas shows information about where the potential customers are located in the city. Very cool. While zoning a residential area highlights ground pollution so that it is easy to avoid when zoning. Very cool, again. It also shows areas that might be otherwise unsuitable, perhaps due to high land value making rent for low density housing very high. So that is actually super cool, that it would go into that much detail for where specific zones are more suitable to be built. With all the added detail and all these added pieces and the depth of the simulation in Cities 2, to have something kind of hold your hand there, I think is probably going to be very important, at least in the beginning, just because, you know, like I was talking about a moment ago, Cities 1, you didn't even really have to pay that much attention to the demand, and now there's so many different things you have to pay attention to the demand for, and very clearly they will impact each other and play an important role in the game and how your city develops. It's just cool that, you know, they give you, with that added responsibility, they give you that added little bit to help you out with that, if that makes sense. And then we move on to zone demand, which kind of strange that is the next section, as I feel like we've already kind of been in that for a few minutes here, but cool, let's dive deeper in. So it says, city growth is largely based on the different zone types needing more space and the symbiotic relationship between them. New citizens move in and require housing, which increases residential demand. Then the new citizens then need jobs and places to go shopping and spend their free time, so industrial and commercial demand increases. And then as industrial manufacturing increases, they need places to sell their produced goods, which then increases commercial zone demand. And as more companies are founded, more job positions become available, which in turn increases demand for more residential housing. So you've got that real kind of cyclical effect, right? People move in, they need jobs. They get jobs, they produce goods. The goods need to be sold, they go back to the consumer, and then you need more people to move in, to live in the residences, and consume the manufactured goods, services, products, whatever. So real life kind of economy stuff as a population grows. But then it gets into adjusting taxes and states that adjusting taxes for the different education levels, as well as the various goods produced and sold in the city, can have a great effect on local demand. Taxes can be used to favor different goods and products manufacturing in the city, or simply give a helping hand to fledgling industries. So again, another sort of realistic thing, you'll often see different policies, rebates, that kind of thing, sort of steering the market. And Yeah, apparently you can do that to some level in the game by adjusting taxes. The thing that I'm kind of curious about is adjusting taxes for different education levels. It would make more sense to me if it was more related to income levels, right? Like in the real world, you have different tax brackets. The more you make, the more you pay, the more the government wants from you, right? But for different education levels, that doesn't seem to necessarily be a direct correlation. Maybe in the game it is, whereas in the real world it is not. Or maybe it's nothing related to income and it is directly just taxing people for having a higher level of education, which seems weird. But I guess we'll see. We'll see when it comes out what is going on with that exactly. And it says additional details about demand can be found in the city information panel. So this actually, I looked at earlier, I think it is really cool. So it'll actually kind of show you what's in demand and why. And it'll also show you, I guess there's a little green plus sign for where everything's kind of good, a little red minus sign where it could be better. So for example, for high density residential, we'll go with that. It looks like there's not enough jobs available, right? So to increase the demand much farther for more people to move into these high density residential buildings. And then it also shows that there are currently some unoccupied buildings. So maybe you don't really need to build any right now, even though it's showing the demand bar is kind of high. It looks like you might still have a little ways to go because there are currently some unoccupied buildings. But you need to provide jobs, fill those buildings, and then I guess this would be probably maxed out, I'm guessing. And that's when you really need to immediately give some people places to live, or they might end up homeless or something weird, which it gets into later in the article. It says something about homeless citizens living in the city, which is quite interesting. I wonder if this is related. It might not be, but in any case. Back to residential demand. So residential demand increases when new citizens want to move in. Makes sense, right? Citizens move in for work. Students also moving in for educational opportunities. So if you have a university, you're going to have a lot of people moving for that reason. Or people simply wanting to move because the city is an inviting location to raise their families. And families and seniors prefer large apartments, thus increasing the low and medium density housing demand. Single-person households and students don't shy away from smaller apartments, favoring medium-density apartment buildings and high-density residential towers. The living costs are also divided among the high number of households, making living cheaper in these zone types, which again, we kind of talked about that earlier. But let's have a look at this. Yeah, really nice looking. It actually looks like almost like a mobile home park, doesn't it? It's almost like a tiny house community, which honestly I think it looks amazing. They're beautiful houses, really, but just little small. Yeah, they look like mobile homes. They look like they're even sitting on top of cinder blocks. That's really cool. I just now noticed that. I've not noticed that before. Very cool. Residential zone demands also increase as jobs in the industrial, commercial, and office sectors become available. Totally makes sense, right? There's, a new factory opens up in the city that you live in. New job opportunities. You might have people moving in from a city or two away, seeking those job opportunities. Totally makes sense. The zones require a workforce, and as new workers move in, they demand suitable housing. When unemployment increases and jobs aren't available, residential demand decreases until the issues are remedied. If the city has a large number of built but unoccupied homes, residential demand can decrease until the available homes become occupied. That makes sense. There should be no demand to build a bunch of new residential buildings if you have a bunch that are already empty. Very clear. Then we move into commercial demand. Commercial zone demand is based on manufacturers producing goods for sale and the availability of potential customers, as well as citizens needing jobs. When industrial zones produce goods, they need to sell them to make a profit, and as the local market is always a more profitable option, they want to sell their goods within the city, which increases the need for local commercial companies. However, having goods and products to sell is only half of the business. The commercial zones also require enough purchasing power from the local citizens to not only survive, but to flourish. Thus, local demand for goods and products is an extremely important factor in commercial demand. Citizens want to buy things for their households, and they also simply want to spend time in their favorite leisure activities, which include shopping. And then here we have high-density commercial buildings that employ more people and can serve more customers. So this is showing those kind of similar to what we had in Cities 1, right? These taller, high-density commercial buildings might be like large, high-rise shopping centers, that kind of thing. And lastly, commercial demand also increases if companies detect the availability of a suitable workforce in the city. When companies have the needed employees to fill the required positions, their profitability increases. Very cool. Then we get on to industrial demand, which is based on citizens needing jobs in the manufacturing sector as well as local commercial companies requiring goods and products to sell. The demand can be further increased by the availability of local resource extraction by specialized industries. Setting up specialized industrial areas provides materials for manufacturing locally, decreasing transport costs and thus increasing profits. Worker availability is one of the cornerstones of industrial demand. Attracting new citizens to the city directly affects the demands of the various sectors, including industrial zones. And as companies always seek to optimize their production, they are in search of suitable workers. As the companies increase in levels, their requirements shift to more educated employees. This leads to increased productivity and efficiency, which in turn manifests in higher profits. Manufacturing also benefits from having local warehouses to store produced goods and products. Companies tend to have relatively small storage facilities and seek to sell all their products as quickly as possible. Warehouses allow more flexibility and time to seek suitable new buyers if no one is currently available, while still keeping production going. So this tells me that there are still going to be warehouses in the game. So as I talked about earlier, in the generic industry, you're going to have all of your factories and you're going to have some sort of, just zoned warehouses pop up. But it looks like actually placing warehouses wisely is going to be a part of managing your industries going forward as well. So that's interesting. Lastly, in terms of demand anyway, we get into office demand, which is increased by citizens wanting to work in the office sector, as well as citizens and businesses needing various immaterial goods that offices provide. Manufacturing industry and other office companies benefit from the software developed in the office zones. As software is produced, more office companies appear as they can further develop this software into other services. So that goes to back to what they were talking about earlier, where you had a sort of a common good, which is software, right? And then that is then further processed into, I believe it mentioned, financial services, insurance, that type thing. And then, of course, this is probably one of my favorite screenshots from the dev diary. That's just beautiful. They're seeing the medium density to high density all kind of flowing, and then even in the background here you can kind of see that low density stuff in the background, and how it all just kind of transitions much more naturally than it did in Cities 1. It was truly difficult. It was an art form, really, to get that transition from low density to sort of a medium, because that wasn't a natural thing in the game, right? You had to sort of do selective zoning and things like that. But anyway, to transition from low to high density was very difficult, and now it looks like it's going to be very organic, not easy, but simpler, I guess, to make a beautiful transition in that way, and just look like more of an organic growth in the city. And lastly, it says, office zone demands also benefits greatly from finding suitable workers to boost productivity and efficiency in the companies. Similar to other companies, the better the workforce matches the needs of the companies, the more profitable they will be. Makes sense. Depending on the age range of the customers, different types of immaterial goods are preferred. Adults and seniors favor banking services and products from the financial sector, while children and teens consume more media products. City specialization. Companies working with the same materials and producing similar products benefit from each other's proximity. That's pretty interesting. Industries and offices concentrate on areas where similar companies already exist. They communicate with each other and have a better chance to hire specialized workers to increase their efficiency. As more and more companies produce the same type of goods or products, they gain a citywide specialization bonus, which increases their efficiency and thus their profit. That is really interesting. I'd like to know more about that. I don't really even know what to think about that, but I'd like to know a lot more about that. City specialization can be assisted by setting up specialized industry areas which harvest materials used by the companies gaining the city specialization bonus. Also, adjusting taxes to be favorable to these products and goods help the industries develop even further. And with zoning demand out of the way, we now get into land value and building levels. And explains that land value is a tool to understand which locations are desirable for citizens and companies, and it spreads through roads to the buildings, closed neighborhoods, slowly increasing the value of the area in general. And in this image here, it states that areas with high land value are very desirable for citizens and businesses. Obviously, that makes sense. But here is the actual sort of menu item showing that. So it shows in the blue here, the actual land value, and then building value, I guess, is from a scale of red to green. Looks like for the most part, everything's in good shape other than right here. There's a tiny little red spot there, which is strange. I wonder what that's about. But very cool. Very cool that it kind of breaks it down into the two sort of categories there, land and building value. I wonder how they're related to each other. I don't know if it'll explain that coming up, or if we'll just have to wait and see how it goes in the game. Okay, so it explains citizens tend to value large homes, the proximity of shops, services they require, schools and workplaces, as well as pollution-free locations. If the citizens find homes that suit their needs, they move in. And if they're happy living there and are wealthy enough, they're able to pay a higher rent, which translates into an increase in the area's land value. It is important to note that simply plopping all city services into a neighborhood doesn't increase the land value in the area automatically. Only when the residents and companies have their needs met, be it with services or shopping options for citizens, customers, and resellers for companies, will land value be affected as the residents and companies feel that the area is valuable to their existence. That makes sense. You know, in real life, land value, property value in general does increase very organically that way, right? Like if there's a lot of job opportunity, a lot of money-making opportunity, educational opportunities, then in that area, value goes up because a lot of people want to move to that area, right? So then it becomes more competitive in terms of higher costs of rent, higher costs of living for people to continue being in those places just because the demand is so high. It comes down to supply and demand, really, right? Just as anything else with economics. It goes on to say if the rent is higher than the upkeep cost of the building, the residents pool their leftover funds into improving the building, which eventually leads to the building leveling up. That's interesting. High demand for a specific zone type can also increase the rent and thus also the land value. As more people want to move into the city, then there are places to live. To keep the land value in check, you can adjust the various residential taxes, encouraging or discouraging citizens to move in. Also, zoning more of those zone types with high demand can help keep the land value in check as the demand is met. It is also possible to simply limit the number of required services and leisure options to keep the land value low. Citizens can tolerate some shortcomings in regard to their needs and still live relatively happy lives. If the citizens are not able and willing to pay higher rent, the rent decreases, which also affects the land value around the building. Residents will move out if the living costs are too high and they don't feel like their needs are met in the area in which they live. And some will even move out of the city altogether. However, if the residents continue to not be able to meet the rent costs, the building will start to deteriorate as no money is used for the building's basic upkeep. The residents then move out in greater numbers and the building becomes abandoned. This further decreases the land value. Abandoned buildings can become occupied by homeless citizens, but due to the constant disrepair, the buildings will eventually collapse. So that's interesting. In Cities 1, you always had the abandoned buildings problem, but it looks like abandoned buildings now you can have squatters. You can have homeless people moving in and squatting until the building eventually entirely collapses. That's very interesting. So we're going to have homeless citizens in City Skylines too. What do you guys think about that? And here we have just, again, a beautiful skyline, and that this looks like actually the same shot almost from a different angle as what we were looking at earlier, right? So I think this shot's taken from back here. And again, just showing that transition from the low density neighborhood homes here, moving out. Looks like, what is that, like a church or something? Are we gonna have churches in the game? That'd be super cool. But anyway, and then it transitions out to more of the medium density out here, and then you have your downtown on the horizon out there, and again, just a beautiful, beautiful, organic looking transition, and I am totally here for it. Land value affects different residential zone types in different ways. Low density housing areas can quickly become expensive to live in as the land value increases. The higher land value affects the rent, and since low density housing has only one household per building, the increased rent falls on the single household entirely. Thus, lower income families tend to move out of these residential areas in search of new homes in medium density housing areas. Medium and high density housing areas are less affected by increased land value as living costs are divided among dozens of households. Many citizens prefer living in smaller homes that cost less than struggling to make their rent. Companies evaluate suitable locations for their businesses partially using land value and the size of the rent, which is subtracted from the value of the company's production. However, companies also take into consideration the location based on the materials' transportation costs. Companies pay for the transportation of materials to their location, as well as the transportation of produced goods and products from the company to resellers and customers. The lower the transportation costs, the more suitable a location is for the company. Similar to residential housing, companies use any money left over from covering the building's upkeep costs to improve the building and eventually level it up. And speaking of building levels, all zoned buildings have building levels from 1 to 5. Building levels represent the progression of the building from a lower to a higher quality building and are a reflection of how wealthy its inhabitants are. As the building increases in level, its upkeep increases, which means that its rent also increases. In residential buildings, electricity and water consumption also decrease per household, and as the buildings change at levels 3 and 5, more apartments are available in medium and high-density residential buildings. In commercial buildings, electricity and water used per unit of goods or products sold decreases. Furthermore, commercial buildings are able to produce goods and services faster, which means that they can sell them cheaper to consumers. This leads to citizens choosing higher-level commercial companies over other options. Similarly, in manufacturing and office buildings, electricity and water used to produce one unit of goods decreases. Higher-level buildings adopt better utility practices, boosting their production efficiency and also generating less garbage and pollution. Visually, buildings change at every other level, representing the increase in the quality of the building. Lower-level buildings have an intended cheaper look, while higher-level buildings adopt a more modern and detailed look. And finally, the last subject of the video today we get into is signature buildings. So with zone types and demand covered, it's time to talk about signature buildings. These are a new feature in Cities 2 and can best be described as unique ploppable zoned buildings that fall into the familiar categories of residential, commercial, industrial, and office buildings. Each signature building has its own unlocking requirements, such as the Sculptor Mansion, having 3 requirements: reaching a certain progression milestone, attaining a specific citizen happiness level, and having a number of cells zoned with low-density residential housing. Once met, the building becomes available and can be placed anywhere on the map, similar to service buildings. The building is unique and can be placed only once, but is entirely free to build. It can be relocated just like any other ploppable building, and bulldozing it allows you to rebuild it again at a later date. So it sounds like signature buildings, essentially, they're just like unique buildings, except that they actually offer something more. They also said it's free to build these, which I think is pretty cool. I'm sure it's not free to maintain them, but to build them anyway, it is free. But it provides it's an actual residential building, right? So it isn't like in City Skylines 1, where unique buildings were basically just tourist attractions, right? All they did was generate tourism and noise pollution. They didn't actually serve any functional purpose beyond that. And increased land value, I guess you could say. But that's it, pretty much, right? But in Cities 2, you're going to have these signature buildings, which are basically unique buildings that actually serve a purpose. So there's going to be, it sounds like, what did it say? Yeah, residential, commercial, industrial, and office buildings. So they're going to have signature buildings fall under all 4 of those categories. So that's pretty cool. And it says residential signature buildings can vary in size from mansions to medium density apartment buildings to residential skyscrapers. Signature buildings function similarly to regular zoned buildings and contribute to the zone-based economic cycle. A residential building welcomes new residents, while a commercial building, office, or factory seeks a suitable business to occupy it. The same laws of success and failure affect the companies residing in the signature buildings as any other business. They require a suitable workforce, compete for the same customers, and try to turn a profit to be successful. And then here, this image beneath it says, signature buildings allow you to build large commercial buildings, massive factories, or impressive offices which function like your zoned buildings. So I want to take a deeper look at this image here. This looks to me like either a very large department store or even like a shopping mall with multiple shops within, although the branding looks pretty uniform. But if this is a department store, my only question with that is it going to be similar to the shopping centers, or what was it, shopping malls content creator pack? One of the more recent ones we got in City Skylines, where you got a couple of cool grocery stores, which made, of course, the North American cities we built at least look more realistic. But you could only place each one once, which I didn't really like. Is it going to be like that? Or are we going to see actual larger department stores as part of the commercial zoned buildings? Are they going to be in there, and we're just going to have a few here that we kind of plop down, so it will look like a nice balance? I don't know, but that's my only question with that. It says also, each signature building has one or more positive effects. These range from effects on the neighborhood to effects that are citywide. So some affect citizen well-being and city attractiveness for tourists, very similar to unique buildings from before, right? While others improve the city's entire industrial sector or boost high-level education effectiveness and more. Wow. Okay. Either way, they offer interesting new effects and options for your city. Coder Park provides both citywide and local benefits. So Coder Park, modern office building where coffee gets converted into game design, art, and code. That's cool. That's really cool. And then it shows you these boosts here that are provided as well. So a plus 1% university graduation chance. That's interesting. Plus 5 well-being for the immediate area within 1 kilometer. Plus 1% office efficiency. That's also citywide. Plus 5% interest in university education. So all 4 of these benefits, 3 citywide, 1 is just in the neighborhood. But very cool. Really cool stuff. And actually, that's it. It just says this concludes today's development diary. We hope that provides you with a good understanding of how zoning works in cities too, with the addition of new zone types and signature buildings. Are you looking forward to incorporating medium density and mixed zoning into your cities? Yes. And what do you think about signature buildings? Very promising, I think. I think very promising. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I'm very interested to see what everybody else thinks about this. I'll say again, the things that stick out for me are, the different residential zoning options again, to actually have 6 different options rather than just high density massive towers and then low density individual, single family homes, to actually have these medium density row housing, to have the mixed use housing that we have here. To just have that variation is going to make the entire cities so much more organic looking, and maybe even make the game feel more organic in the way your city grows. I'm also very interested in how, actually looking at these signature buildings in action. I guess, I understand how they work now, especially looking at this one as we just did with it showing the boost. But I'm very interested in, how many of these signature buildings we might have, how many are residential, how many are commercial, how many we might have for industrial or offices. I just wonder how many different signature buildings there are going to be that have these interesting little combinations of boosts. And I feel like every city can be a little bit different from the last. Whereas in City Skylines 1, it always felt like there was a little bit of a repetition to it, right? Where the assets and the ideas for, the only 3 different types of zone, I guess offices, but that counted as industrial before, right? So 3 different types of zoning, and not a very in-depth economy the way that they're going for this time. It was always a little bit limited, and you'd end up building kind of the same city, you know, over and over, at least in my experience. And I feel like with all the depth that they're adding to City Skylines 2, that's not really going to be a thing. It looks like it's going to be, every city is going to be unique and an opportunity to build something really awesome. But anyway, that's it for the video today. Let me know what you guys think. What questions you have, any comments, suggestions for future videos, things like that. But also specifically just about the zoning and signature buildings. If there's anything you noticed in the dev diary that maybe I missed, or something I said that maybe is clearly wrong and you can correct, or anything you want to expand on, anything like that, feel free to leave a comment down below. It is encouraged. And again, please like, subscribe, do all the things. But for now, thank you for watching and have a great day.